I'm a global macro investor, and economics, markets, politics, and geopolitics all matter.
In my life, there have been a number of times where things came along that I never saw before, and they surprised me, cost me money. And then I realized when I studied history that they happened many times in history, repeatedly.
And there were three things that are happening in our lifetimes that never happened in my lifetime or our lifetimes, and that I learned before I had to study past periods. And those three things are the creation of a lot of debt and money. The second is the amount of internal conflict that we're having over money and values and what that's like. And the third is the changing world order with countries like China and Russia competing with the United States in a way that didn't exist before. It's a basic thing. Everybody agrees we need more money and we need more spending. But if you spend more than you earn, you have to borrow. And that creates debt. At first, it's credit, so it gives you buying power. But you have to pay it back, and that becomes depressing. And so in order to avoid that, central banks can print money and buy it back. But when they do that, that depreciates the value of money. So what we had was a lot of money and credit go out to a lot of people, a lot of buying power. Everybody, when they got it, they thought, oh, that's great. And somehow they seemed surprised that when they spend it, the prices of everything go up. But the truth is that if you divide the amount of money and credit that's used for spending by the quantity of goods produced, you can calculate, well, the prices will change. And so that's what's going on. And that's what went on in a giant wave, the Federal Reserve and the government together. And that produced a giant amount of inflation, between 7.5% if you use year over year, or if you take the core inflation rate, it's closer to 12 and it's rising. There's some temporary influence, but it's basically because of the amount of spending. You can measure the amount of spending, not because of the bottlenecks. Buying power is what matters, right? So what happens is when inflation goes up faster than your other sources of income, you lose buying power. But somehow that seems more acceptable sometimes to people than if it was just taken out of your pocket. You see, if they, let's say, raise taxes or take it out of somebody's pocket, everybody complains, whoever's had the pocket taken out of. But if it comes through printing of money and everybody gets checks, it's more acceptable. But those who are holding money, like money market funds and bond funds, lose the buying power of that. So think about those bond funds. Those bond funds are like down about 10%, and inflation is up over, let's call it 8%. So they lost 18% of the buying power. We think of it as meaning higher prices, but to some extent, that's a rich man's perspective because they say, oh, now I have to pay more. But the reality is you don't get more stuff from that higher inflation. And so it bids it out of the hands of some people. And that hurts the people who don't get it. And so we're seeing a time now where you're going to lose buying power to inflation. And now you're going to see the Federal Reserve also tighten money and credit and raise interest rates. And when they do that, that creates less buying power. You know, they say, okay, now you can't spend as much money and the prices are going high, but they do that in their crude way of trying to reduce inflation. But you get it from both ends, the higher prices and then the higher interest rates you have to pay and the higher debt service costs and also less availability of money. So it's a squeeze, like the squeeze that happened in the 1970s. These things go in paradigm shifts that quite often take, relatively long time because everybody's mindset is in a certain place and they're doing certain things. For example, investors think that cash is safe and they don't pay much attention to inflation. And then what happens is they get inflation and they realize that if I'm holding cash, I'm losing buying power. So then they shift, they sell out their cash or they sell out their bonds and they put that into other things. And when they do that, that also contributes to inflation. Changes like that also happen in a lot of ways, like cost of living increases in compensation, where in the past, when they don't worry about inflation, then they don't think about, do I have an inflation-linked contract for my work? Or do I have enough inflation assets? It might be, oh, do I need to buy, I'm going to store my money in a house. And so that pendulum swing from one mindset and one positioning to another mindset and another positioning in the early stages tends to be self-reinforcing. Those actions produce more inflation and more inflation psychology until that goes to the opposite extreme. Like in the 1970s, people were surprised about what happened because they weren't used to inflation much. Then you had the inflation, and in the beginning, it swung. And then at the end of it, they said inflation will never end, and everybody's positioned for it never ending. And then, of course, what happens is it's so bad that then the central bank goes the opposite extreme, and then they get surprised. And so the 80s was a period which was the exact opposite of the 70s, where you have falling inflation, high real interest rates, and so on. And so the worst assets to own in the 70s were bonds, and the best assets to own in the 80s were bonds. So you see these pendulum swings that way. The amount of political polarity is the greatest since 1900. The amount of compromise is the lowest it's been. It's measured by how voting across party lines. There are two monoliths, and they're at war with each other. And we have populism, which is you have to get on one side or the other. So when the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. The risk of neither party accepting losing the elections is significant. The move toward power dynamics, the idea of democracy is compromise, reaching across that the law and the rule is of a higher purpose than anything else. But when you get other things that are more important to people that they're willing to fight for, then you get greater and greater. And it's self-reinforcing because moderates are people who want to work across party lines and so on, and compromise are through history, through the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, or these are civil wars. In all of those cases, the moderates, they're hurt or they're disposed of, and you have to pick a side. But you're seeing this now. The ideologies are dominant. So for example, when Elon Musk buys Twitter, the decisions he will make regarding Twitter will probably have a greater effect on our society than the decisions the Supreme Court makes. It's one of the symptoms that it's not normal economics in the usual way. So it's a different game that people should be aware of. I have a principle, which is that if you worry, you don't have to worry. And if you don't worry, you need to worry. Because if you worry about things like if you read about the consequences of what has happened in history, and you look at the likelihood and you say, okay, we can have this kind of a conflict, or we could have that kind of a conflict, external conflict, and boy, these conflicts are terrible. Maybe that sort of brings us more together because we have the power together if we don't fight each other in that way, and we can compromise and so on. I was just in Singapore, and what they had is they had savings. Because they have a large savings, the income from that savings covers 20% of their budget. So one generation is giving the other generation a savings, a good education, and civility. And this happens in certain places. What we have left our generation with is debts, a broken down infrastructure, and fighting. I mean, the answer is if we're all good with each other and we're productive and we earn more than we spend, we won't have a problem. But we got to get there. If I was president of the United States, I would have a bipartisan cabinet to try to bring moderates from both sides. I'd have an economic program that was put together like a Manhattan Project, in which smart people from both sides would make changes. I have my own changes that could happen, in which they would both increase the size of the pie and divide it well. I mean, move much more toward equal opportunity in which people are productive. I'll describe the cycle. By an order, I mean like a world order or domestic order, a system that's in place, run by the people who have the power, and then they determine what the system is like. So you change orders, usually by wars, because you have a conflict, and then, okay, how do you resolve the conflict? They have a war. So World War II ended in 1945. The United States won World War II dominantly. It became the richest country in the world, having 80% of the world's money. Money was gold then. It had 80% of the world's gold. And a dominant military. It had a monopoly on that, and it accounted for half the world's economy. And so it set the rules. It's the reason why the United Nations is in New York and the IMF and the World Bank in Washington, D.C. It was the American world order because it was dominant power. Now, when you are in a dominant power, also these wars are sort of great equalizers. People come back from the war. It's not like some are rich and some are poor in the same way. There's a restructuring and you don't have the same wealth gaps and resentments and so on. And that usually means that you have a period of peace and prosperity. Peace because nobody wants to fight the dominant power. And then they work together and they produce peace and prosperity, and that happens. And that's really does best in the capitalist system, in which capital is provided to those who have good ideas because they say, we'll invest in you and you'll be productive and so on. But what capitalism does at the same time is it creates large wealth gaps, and it also creates higher levels of indebtedness. So it creates the large wealth gaps because it distributes that unequally. And then that can be self-perpetuating because those who get power, like if you have more money, you can educate your children better. Gradually, you lose equal opportunity and you produce wealth gap and you produce resentments. And you also then create larger amounts of debt quite often. That means that that's a problem down the road. Now, what happens when you become the world's largest power, this is also always the case. It happened with the Dutch, it happened with the British, that because you're so powerful and production, you go all around the world and you are the largest trading country in the world. You get more exports than other countries and more transactions are in your currency. And so everybody uses your currency, which becomes the world's reserve currency. And because it's the world's currency, different countries save in it, which means that they lend to you in it. And that increases your debt to foreigners because when they hold a bond, or they hold cash in that, they're lending it to you to get the dollars back in the future. And so that is also one of the ingredients of making a top. There are the wealth gaps, there's that. And then there's also a change in generations and generation psychology. The greatest generation, in a sense, are those who fought through the war, appreciate basic things, that kind of a thing. And then what happens is when you're on top, you become more expensive and quite often more decadent. I mean, you might spend on things that are not good investments and don't last very long or whatever, for entertainment at the sake of buying. So for example, in the United States, I remember when we had a per capita income, which was 40 times China's, and we started borrowing from China. So these are the ingredients. And then you start to see that they cause problems, the financial problem, the internal conflict problem, and so on. And then the type of fighting that we're talking about. It's so interesting because in the mid 1600s, this is interesting. There was 30 years of war. They call it the 30 Years' War in Europe. And they just kept beating the daylights out of each other. And that is when they invented countries as we know it. Before then, there were no boundaries. And what mattered was power. And if you wanted something that the other guy had, you'd go get it and he'd do the same with you. And there was this constant fighting about things. And then in the 1600s, they were fighting about religion too. There's the religious Reformation and the others, which also had to do with power because the church was powerful. But anyway, so they invented countries as we know it with boundaries, and you determine what goes on in your borders and so on. And of course, for the next 100 years, there were hardly any wars. But when the time comes, there's no universal legal system. There's no universal policeman. So if you don't have a universal legal system, there have been attempts at that with the United Nations or before that, the League of Nations. They attempted that, but power rules. And so you're going to have tests of power. It'll come down to tests of power. I want everything that I do to not be opinionated. A very big leading indicator is the relative level of education. And those that have more educated population, and you could see the numbers rise, you could see education levels in one country or another rise or decline in these charts. So you could see how is the United States in its education and how are other countries, and is that gap improving or worsening? Because education levels are very indicative of well-being and economic behavior. Rule of law, countries that have rule of law and respect for the law that keeps order and effectively, when crime rates go up, it's a problem. A very good indicator is corruption levels. There's a corruption index that all countries have. You can see how it changes. And as it goes up, there's a negative 52% correlation with the growth of a country and its corruption over the next 10 years. The USA is reasonably good on the corruption element. Russia is bad. It's interesting because these are predictors of the future. And what you find out is, like, if you look at Russia, I'll give that as an example, it's blessed with the greatest natural resources of any country in the world. The value of its natural resources are 40% higher than the next highest country, which is the United States. And it does a pretty good job of having an educated population. It's not heavily indebted and so on, but it's cultural issues in terms of these things like corruption. Also, there are measures of bureaucracy versus efficiency. Lots of measures of attitude. Can I start a business and make my dreams happen? You can see the differences between countries on just that attitude, okay? And also you could see it in the bureaucracy. How long does it take to set up a business? There are statistics like that. If there was education and experience from the age of 5 to 15, that would change everything. We learn differently. Scientists have shown prior to puberty, we learn in an internal way. And you'll find that a number of people had their passion at around age 12, because that has to do with how the brain changes. But if you take that 5 to 15 and you incorporate it in the education system and practice of saving, spending, and so on, you don't need a PhD in this thing. The money thing is kind of very basic, If I can buy it for less than I sell it, that's a good thing. The more volume I could do, the better it is. Then there are fixed costs and there are variable costs. So if I'm going to build a lemonade stand, okay, what's that going to cost me? Okay, that's a capital expenditure. It's all the same stuff that you could learn, at those ages, and you don't. I spent a lot of time in China starting in 1984. Not to earn money because they didn't have any money, but because I was very curious. And then I got to know and like the people, and I was able to help them develop their stock markets and things. And so I watched. Since 1984, when I first started, per capita income has increased by 26 times. The poverty rate, measured by hunger, went from 88% to less than 1%. And life expectancy increased an average of 10 years. Hunger was 88%, that type of poverty. And so what has happened is they have become a roughly comparable power of the United States, in some ways a bit ahead, in some ways a bit behind, and so on. And that's in most things. If you talk about a military, is it in that region? Is it of that type? Or is it another type or something? But it's comparable. If you talk about technology, when I first went to China, I would give $10 calculators to people and they thought they were miracle devices. Now, if you take it in artificial intelligence and most technologies, there depends on the one. There may be ahead in some and not. So what that means is that they've come up to be a leading competitive power. There's no other competitive power like that. Now, a lot of countries now, which is scary, are roughly comparable in military. Meaning if you have a war, if we have a war with Russia, it's not like the United States is militarily dominant or so. And more countries have become that way. We spend more and we have bases in 70 countries, but at the same time, that means we're overextended or extended. And it doesn't mean that you'd win a war. If there was a war in Europe, everybody'd be a loser. And there are different types of wars, cyber wars, as well as military wars and the like. What we're now having is a situation where there is that rivalry that could be good, healthy competition. However, history has shown when you deal with who's going to set the rules of the game, there might be disagreements. And if there are disagreements, how are they resolved? Like the trade dispute. It's not like both sides took it to the World Trade Organization and say, we're going to plead our cases and then you make a decision. They didn't even think about that, right? They go to, I'm going to do this if you do this. And that's where we are, sort of. So the world is breaking up into these parts where there are two sides, kind of. Like if you look at World War II, by way of example, there are the Allied powers and the Axis powers. And then they're in Europe and in Asia. And there are different alliances in Europe than there are in Asia, because each has their own interests. And it's developing that way. So when you take the Ukraine and you look at the Ukraine and that, That's more aligned with the other side, let's call it the Axis powers, which are the challengers to the United States and to some extent the NATO powers. And you have that conflict. And you could see in a number of statistics or actions how the sides are lining up. Like, for example, they just ask, are you going to apply the sanctions or not? Are you going to do this and that? In the United Nations, did you vote against Russia or not? And so on. And you could see all those things and you could see how the sides line up. For example, India lined up with Russia. So you could see how this is lining up. And you could see that we're coming into this. There's no conversations and communications that's even polite between the two countries right now, right. These things. And that's where we are. And if you look at history, that's a dangerous place to be. I think that there's better than an even chance of a bad stagflation, a very bad stagflation, because of the dynamics. I'll say 1 in 3 chance, but I think it's actually probably higher than that we have a type of civil war, internal conflict, in which the rules are not followed, the compromises are not made, that maybe they don't accept losing an election, that there's movement of people to different states that they believe represent them better. And there's a polarity developing and they're going to different states, and that there's not obeying the central government. So now it becomes a power game. I'm in the business, I need to be objective because accuracy is my thing. I have to be as accurate as possible. I'm not saying that's accurate, but I'm saying when I look at that, I don't think, my assuming that's a 1 in 3, I think it's actually probably higher than that there will be that kind of a situation. And I think it's higher than a 1 in 3, I think maybe significantly higher, that you get into the same conflict in the power internationally. For example, does Russia or the West win the war in the Ukraine? I'll define Putin winning the war as 3 things. He gains control of the eastern part of the Ukraine. Russia's economy is not devastated by sanctions, and he remains in power. And let's say, for example, he can attend and Russia attends the next G20 meeting. So that's him winning the war, because in the beginning of that, it was worth his cost. I mean, he wants more than that. He wants a neutral Ukraine or an aligned Ukraine. But he's not going to probably go and get that. But that's the minimum. Now, that's him winning the war. That's also kind of the West losing the war. But if he loses the war, if he loses that, he will probably escalate, okay? Because the war is now being played as a on the ground, armies to armies, and with sanctions. But he has other weapons. And rather than go down, he will probably escalate. That's a game of chicken. It's a very dangerous game. And there are other issues globally. For example, you're seeing these alliances work out, and the United States, for various reasons, sort of pull out of the Middle East, and you're seeing China more move in. And so these tensions exist and power exists. There are more countries that have nuclear weapons now than there were. You know, there's even talk of joint military operations between China and Iran. And so you see these sides begin to align. So if I say that there's a 1 in 3 chance of some kind of a military confrontation that scares the hell out of us, or that is extremely, I don't think that sounds too high. I think it's larger than that. So that means I think we're headed for some risky times, because any one of those things is not normal. It's pretty bad. If everybody worries, they don't have to worry. If both sides think about what that's like, and say, I can't, we must come together and make sure that that does not happen. The best assets to not own, that's the most important, I think, is cash. I'm quoted, cash is trash. There will be a tightening here for the time being, and that tightening will have an effect. It'll hurt asset prices and so on. But cash is not the asset to own, and bonds are not good to own, in my opinion, because it's debt. It's owning somebody's debt. And you won't get a return. Think of it, the interest rate will not reach the inflation rate. So that's the problem. Then what you have to have, I think most importantly, is a well-diversified portfolio of other assets. Diversification is a very powerful tool because it can reduce risks without reducing expected returns. Now, there's lots of ways of getting what you think good investments are. They might be things you know about, local businesses and so on, or they might be stocks, or they could be maybe a little gold, or maybe a little bit foreign investing. Diversification is very important to do that in a balanced way. So I would generally say that would be what I would recommend. This was 1982, 83. I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to help to take care of my family bills. So I remember thinking, how many weeks could I live if I lost my income? And I started counting in weeks. I think that's the way to do it. And then assume that its buying power over the next number of years can fall by 3 or 4% a year. Or if you put it in a risky investment, like stocks or something, it can fall by more. So cut that number maybe in half and have twice as much, because you have to understand that that's your freedom. That is your safety. So that first band, you must take care of that. Once you get past that and you feel, okay, I can take care of my family in a worst case scenario, then you have the freedom to then take other kinds of risks. But when you're building that portfolio, it's the same thing as when you have a lot of portfolio past that, just you want to diversify well, because you could see what happens to the markets. Every market, stock market, bond market, most markets have had times where they've gone down over an extended period 60 or 70% in buying power. One thing I do for my kids and grandkids, and always did, was for every holiday, like Christmas or their birthday, I would give them a gold coin. And I said, I never want you to sell that gold coin until there's an emergency, a real emergency, never because you want to buy things. And the reason I did that, and they'll build over a period of time. And I said, don't even sell it. You pass it to your kids unless there's an emergency. And so you're building that savings. Because I think we so easily spend so much money on junk. I didn't like debt because of the fact that there's an obligation and it's like, oh, if I get, then I'm going to be drowning. I'm trying to keep my head against water. This is just my own bias. But anyway, the truth is, if you find individual bets that are diversifying, that your return will equal the average of those returns, but your risk can be cut by 80%. By a bet, I mean, like if you say, I'm going to invest in the stock market, you can see whatever the bet is, look back in history, it gives you a pretty good idea of how it goes up and down, what your risks are. Do that by looking at it in inflation adjusted terms is the best way, but it goes up and down and you can see how your buying power is. If the worst case happened, what would that look like? And I'm telling you, like I'm saying, that the worst cases when you look at that is something like 60 or 70% in buying power, whether that's stocks or bonds. However, if you do that with uncorrelated investments, like when commodities go up, bonds go down, that kind of thing, and you balance things, then you find some part goes up when the other part goes down. And by doing that, you can reduce the risk without reducing the return. Holy Grail means if you follow this path, this will be the key to your riches. 10 to 15 good uncorrelated return streams. I always have to think about what's the worst case scenario. Can I handle the worst case scenario, whatever that is? You can be a great investor, you can be great at anything, and it'll only be one time that knocks you out. One time will kill you. It's often the case that I believe I can produce a significantly higher return, I have, than the cost that I pay for debt. So it's a logical thing to do it, and I still don't do it much. And there's one thing about debt for consumption and debt for investment. Debt for consumption is really bad because the asset goes away and you're left with this obligation. And, that's risky and it's stressful, piles up. You're living above your means. Don't do that. It's not a good idea. Whereas if you have debt for investment, you better be pretty sure that the returns on that investment will be higher than you have to give back in money in the form of both interest rates and the principal repayments.
Every investment is a lump sum payment for a future cash flow. It's true of all investments. So when you're looking at it and you say, I'm going to make a lump sum payment, what are the determinants of those future cash flows?
The best investments are typically those things that you're closest to, and they fall into two types. Those that affect your living standards. Like I think owning a house or an apartment or your residence affects your life a lot. And the cost of it is not the cost of it. In other words, you buy it at a certain price. It's not like the thing that goes away and you consume, so you'll sell it at a certain price. And probably you'll modify it over a period of time. You'll make things, and it produces kind of a forced savings that also brings you joy and brings you a better environment, generally speaking. So, and then the other thing is things that you might know really, really well. Is it your own little business? But you could still take the cycle. So those are the two things that I think that are good for. I should say that one thing when I did that, I discovered the three forces that I mentioned. I discovered a fourth and a fifth that are very important and big. One is that, interestingly, acts of nature in the form of droughts, floods, and pandemics have had a bigger impact than the things I've been talking about in terms of cost more lives or toppled more civilizations in those acts of nature. So I think that's something only that we have to be concerned about. But number five, over long periods of time, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, the most powerful force is man's ability to adapt and invent. Here's a Great Depression and here's a war. And as you see those things, they look like blips on the chart of life expectancy, per capita income, and so on. So there's a tremendous capacity for dealing with all the other stuff if man can adapt to it well. And inventiveness during this period of time should be kind of, I think, really great, because what we're using more and more is types of technology, artificial intelligence and so on. The ability to think and collect data and use the computer to help us with that is a very, very powerful force. Now, like any forces, it's also a risky force because it can be used for bad as well as for good. I think the world will evolve. We will have these cycles in the world. So that's what you see. You see these cycles, and then you see evolution through those cycles and adaptation. And so I expect that. But I would say there's the probabilities I gave you before, that concern me. A lot will be unknown. We have a lot of potential and a lot of things to worry about. I think we're in an era of that money as we know it, which is a fiat money, is being devalued, and it's going to change. The dollar's role is going to change, and that alternatives are going to compete with that. So, I wouldn't want to own money when you own a dollar, let's say, is in the form of a debt instrument. So you're going to get paid back in that. And I think it'll have a negative real rate, negative buying power, and so on in almost any currency. And they're all competing. So they're all devaluing, essentially. And so money is both a medium of exchange and a storehold of wealth that is portable and works in most countries. And now we'll find out what those things are. Gold is an example of one of those, and crypto is an example of those. Maybe NFTs are, and who knows? I think we're in a kind of a who knows kind of phase. New things come along, and I think they'll compete. People will start to think about, how do I have a portfolio of those things that are widely accepted, that I can and that maintain buying power? There's challenges to that. Like when you have a lot of volatility in it, it means that, oh my God, my owning it is more risky than my not owning it. And so that drives money into sort of other things. But anyway, we're going to struggle with that. And you're going to see digital currencies in different countries and so on. And I honestly don't know. I don't think one thing wins out. I do think that a lot of the crypto, like all markets, they go through phases. And there's kind of the bubble phase where it goes up a lot and everybody believes it and everybody's bought it. And then you have the adjustments and so on. I think there's too much emphasis in it because the total value, of Bitcoin or even the cryptocurrency is comparable to the value of Microsoft. One has to think, when one thinks of assets, I would rather think about the whole array of assets than to think about, is it going to be that crypto Bitcoin one?
Yes.
I think people can be too concentrated on that. And I think that could be dangerous. Diversification is my key. Let me start off by saying I acquired it by an accident because the game that I happened to fall in love with, if you learn to play the game well, it pays well. Well, I think that's true with a lot of people who are coming up with ideas and building businesses and so on. They got excited about it, it works well, and then it pays well. To me, it's a serious mistake thinking that success is measured in such things because money has no intrinsic value. Okay, what does money get you? And what do you need? Now, what I want is freedom and the ability to be creative and do that's what I want. and money helps me get that. It helps me help other people. It helps me have the impact. I like those things about it. I think that success is having the life that you want to have, as long as you're earning more money than you spend. And that can be spending very little and having a wonderfully luxurious life. I watch a lot of people don't have much money, of different ages, sometimes young, sometimes older. They travel around the world, they backpack, they go to different cultures and different places. They can live in a tent and the most beautiful nature is available to you, or you can be in a hostel, or you can meet in so many different, and freedom and so on. I think everybody should almost experience that to know that they can have a great deal of freedom without a great deal of money. And that status thing is a silly thing. Okay, that's like being hung up on living your life for approvals. And so don't get on the track and lose sight that, okay, what is it that you really want in your life? What is a successful life for you? It's not measured by how much money you have or how much status you have or almost that other stuff. It's measured in, like I would say, meaningful work and meaningful relationships. If you have something as your work that you're into and your craft and it's a thing you love and you have meaningful relationships, I think those are the most important things to make a rich life.